There's a book called America's 60 Families, which is worth referencing, written in 1937, written by Ferdinand Lundberg, if I pronunciate that correctly. He makes this point pretty clear. I'm going to read a segment of what he writes. J.P. Morgan and Company played a leading role in the national election of 1912. Roosevelt's pre-convention backers were George W. Perkins and Frank Munsey. These two, indeed, encouraged Roosevelt to contest Taft's nomination. Munsey functioned in the newspaper field for J.P. Morgan and Company. Perkins resigned from J.P. Morgan and Company in January 1911 to assume a larger political role. The suspicion seemed justified that the two were not overly anxious to have Roosevelt win. The notion that Perkins and Munsey may have wanted Wilson to win is partly substantiated by the fact that Perkins put a good deal of cash behind Wilson's campaign, to the extent of $35,500, while also simultaneously supporting the campaign of Roosevelt. And this is a really long thing. I don't want to go through all this because I know I only have 20 minutes before Acharya comes on. I want you guys to go into the source and read pages 106 to 112 of Ferdinand Lundberg's book, America's 60 Families. He details exactly how this went. I don't want to waste too much time on it because I just don't want to run out of time. I want to get through as much of this as I possibly can. I'm only halfway through and only have 20 minutes left. Now, in the end, while we can never know the full truth about this election, there's a lot of information to support this political maneuver, and again, which has precedent. So, I want to read a quote by Republican Louis T. McFadden on the Federal Reserve, just to further compound that people in Congress, some of them, were very much against this institution. He says, Mr. Speaker, it is a monstrous thing for this great nation of people to have its destinies presided over by a traitorous government board acting in secret concert with international usurers. Every effort has been made by the Federal Reserve Board to conceal its power, but the truth is the Federal Reserve Board has usurped the government of the United States. It controls everything here, and it controls all our foreign relations. It makes and breaks governments at will. No man and no body of men is more entrenched in power than the arrogant credit monopoly which operates the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks. Now, very quickly, a lot of people that take all of McFadden's tremendous opposition to the Fed with all sorts of really intelligent analysis, they dismiss him as a racist, which he certainly was. But you can't just dismiss somebody because they're racist. You have to look at the information they're presenting. You can't just attack somebody and dismiss everything they're doing because you don't like what they believe. Excuse me. He was a belligerent racist, but that doesn't dismiss his opinions on the nature of government and the way the Federal Reserve Board was orchestrated. Okay, moving on. The next issue has to do with the false notion that the Federal Reserve was an economic stabilizer and there to stop inflation and panics, as was assumed after the 1907 panic when this idea was first pushed. The Zeitgeist movie contends that it is historically not the case and only furthered the ability of financial manipulation. Debunkers, of course, dismissed this, saying that since the Great Depression, the overall state of the Fed has created stability since the Great Depression. Well, we certainly haven't seen that now. Since the Great Depression, there have been about 13 major recessions, and we, of course, are in a near depression right now. So on the basic level, I find it hard to defend the ability of the Fed to create stability. There's nothing historically, even long before the central banks came into power, if you look at the panics before that, there's still panics on an equal basis as far as time. They've gotten worse, though, because it's a conglomeration of power. So the interconnection of everything and the monopoly held means that everything's connected. So the failure of one area here and the failure of one area here and the failure of one area here is no more. It's the failure of the system now. And that's really what needs to be understood. And that's the danger of having this type of monopoly of money supply. It's also important to point out that the ebb and flow of the boom and busts, that is, the business cycle, this is created by the policy of the Federal Reserve. They control the ebb and flow of the business cycle. That's their role. So the collapses and the booms are managed. And I can guarantee you that they know long in advance when these recessions and booms are about to come. By the way, these booms and bust cycles did not exist before these central banks came into power. because it was regional. It couldn't. There would be minor ones all over the place. Now we have these massive holistic booms and busts that happen all over the world because of the power of the central banks across the world, not to mention the interconnection and collusion of all the central banks in existence, which is easily provable. I mean, they regulate things. The European banks, American banks, they meet, and they decide what to do as far as currencies to balance things out in this basically big game of chess. That power that they have in yield is unbelievable. Okay, I'm running out of time. Going back to the panic of 1920, the Zeitgeist makes a statement that money supply increased from... Actually, you know what? Since I'm running out of time, I'm going to jump ahead because I'm having a difficult time to... excuse me, I just want to get the correct points out there because I made my list too long, so I want to go and find the best ones to talk about that have the best basis. Congressman Lindbergh stated that under the Federal Reserve Act, in regard to 1920, the statement, which is in the film, under the Federal Reserve Act, panics are scientifically created. The present panic is the first time scientifically created one. Worked out as we figure a mathematical equation. This quote does exist as opposed to some debunkers from his book, The Economic Pinch of 1923. We're going to go straight to Great Depression. I'm going to skip the information I have on this one. Actually, no, let me point this out. The panic of 1920 was led by an expansion and collapse. It was a massive boom and bust, basically, with an extreme bust. Senator Robert Owen, prior chairman of the Senate Banking and Currency Committee, gives a detailed explanation. Quote, in May 1920, the farmers were exceedingly prosperous. They were paying off their mortgages. They had bought a lot of new land. At the instance of the government, had borrowed money to do it. And then they were bankrupted by a sudden contraction of credit and currency which took place in 1920. What took place in 1920? The Federal Reserve Board met in a meeting which was not disclosed to the public. They met on the 18th of May 1920, and it was a secret meeting, and they spent all day. The minutes made 60 printed pages. It appears in Senate Document 310 of February 19th, 1923, under action taken by the Federal Reserve Board on May 18, 1920. There resulted a violent contraction of credit. This contraction of credit and currency had the effect the next year of diminishing the national production $15 billion. It had the effect of throwing millions of people out of work due to unemployment. Now, the 1920 collapse and crash. Debunkers all over the place on this one. The first issue is they talk about the margin call loans and how the margin call loans are unfounded because a margin call can only be triggered when the value of the loan reaches a certain point. This is true for basic margin calls as it exists today, but not for the margin call loan. The call loan is, quote, a loan that can be terminated at any time by either party. You can find the definition in any financial dictionary. In 1929, there were many of these loans outstanding. They were called literally 24-hour broker call loans, which were basically forms of margin loans. These could be called at any time, and once those calls occurred, all the other margin loans, which were based on values of the loans, were eventually triggered due to the extreme drop of the stock, setting off a chain reaction. The next debunking issue has to do with insiders and J.D. Rockefeller and the like. In fact, one debunker said that J.D. Rockefeller was actually altruistic because he helped to buy stocks when they were going down in an attempt to kind of stem the decline. Well, this is true that he did buy stocks. He did come back into the market only after it dropped substantially, making a goddamn fortune. He was buying value, likely knowing the short-term nature of the market collapse. And like all strategic players and possible insiders, they were, like all the strategic players and possible insiders, which they made their move after the severe drop and made a killing after the public was shaken out. And to clarify this, the New York Herald Tribune on October 31st, 1929 wrote, quote, revived by spontaneous investment buying and declarations of large extra cash dividends by leading companies and free of the delirium that has recently gripped share owners, the stock market yesterday received a fresh start and scored a record comeback. Volume on the stock exchange totaled 10 million, blah, 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 blah. We won't talk about that. The high spot of the day from the stock market viewpoint was a statement by John D. Rockefeller that there was no need to destroy value and that he and his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had been heavy buyers of stocks for investment in the last few days and would continue to buy at present prices.